book 4 of Middlemarch is called Three Love Problems. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the three are. I mean, um, Dorothy and Casaubon, uh, Lydgate and Rosie are certainly two. But what is the third? Dorothea and Ladislaw, or Fred and Mary, or I don't know, Fairbrother and Mary. It's a little bit ambiguous. Um, I wonder if I'm just being obtuse or not reading it, or if that's intentionally vague. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. But I've been giving sort of alternate titles to the different books, and I thought the phrase, I noticed the term sprigs came up quite a lot. Troublesome sprigs, odd sprigs, surprising offshoots. Important implication of the motif of the web is that love doesn't work out exactly as intended. This is a lesson that I associate with Frankenstein, that we can't dictate our progeny, and in the broadest sense, our intentions for the next generation, or our intentions, the consequences of our behavior are not entirely under our control. We do things, and then the effects are out in the web of interaction of the world. So we're often left to confront troublesome sprigs, surprising outcomes or offshoots. So I wonder if that's part of the idea of the three love problems. Like, what are the three? Like, I wonder if we're actually supposed to be a little confused by that title, or it could just be my personal confusion. So speaking about odd sprigs, unintentional off growth, um, I wonder how sort of relativistic Eliot is. She's so compassionate. She's always referring to poor Casaubon. So does that make every implication or consequence relativized, has its own point of view, its own sort of moral justification? It's hard for me to think that's true. Casaubon seems so toxic. The way in which he makes others, especially Dorothea, suffer for his paranoia just seems suffocating. Not that he doesn't suffer, but he's the cause of his own suffering as well as many other people's suffering. So that's to say that Eliot's compassion for all her characters, I think, disguises some distinctions, some moral distinctions between healthy and unhealthy, toxic and wholesome growth, contribution to the social web of life. In other words, I'm wondering how much does Casaubon represent not just a physical but a moral disease of the heart, undeserving of sympathy because he's himself actively corrosive of sympathy. There's something pathological, toxic that we're supposed to notice about the way he strangles the life out of himself as well as Dorothy. I think Eliot suggests kind of distinction I'm talking about right at the beginning of book 4. In her discussion of Featherstone, she begins by saying, "We're all imaginative in some form or another, for images are the brood of desire." So we all desire and we produce images. We are the brood, are the offspring. So she's thinking about imagination, sort of like, as I was suggesting, as procreation. Just the way in which our intentions are already procreated. But listen to how Eliot proceeds here. I think poor old Featherstone, who laughed much at the way in which others cajoled themselves, did not escape the fellowship of illusion. So he's part of that family, that organic web, giving birth to images of desire. In writing the program for his burial, he certainly did not make clear to himself that his pleasure in the little drama of which it formed a part was confined to anticipation. in chuckling over the vexations he could afflict by the rigid clutch of his dead hand. He inevitably mingled his consciousness with that livid, stagnant presence. And so far as he was preoccupied with future life, it was with one of gratification inside his coffin. Thus old Featherstone was imaginative after his fashion. Now, that just seems toxic. Nation is just serving death. He's serving a corpse and making other people serve his corpse. That just, seems malignant. I think that something similar is going on with Casaubon. There's some foreshadowing going on here. Don't mean to spoil anything, but I think we already see in this book the world is just hostile to him and threatening, a source of worry and anxiety on all sides. He's lost his willingness to risk engagement of life. Eliot highlights the scene of Featherstone's funeral, not necessarily as foreshadowing, but as a memory that will stay with Dorothea, like the scene at St. Peter's. An image and mood get crystallized for her in a way that she'll remember. In a way, it really underscores the theme of neighbors. She wishes she knew her neighbors better. That's something that she, as troubled her throughout her life, is feeling cut off from her fellow Middlemarchers. So one set of neighbors reminds her to see another set of neighbors, and it has to do with upper class and lower class. And this is maps onto the physical layout of the scene very explicitly. The upper class gentry are looking down from Lowick Manor on the congregation of kind of riffraff that Mrs. Cadwallader actually refers to as animals. Mrs. Cadwallader doesn't think of them as neighbors. She thinks of them as a animalistic spectacle to look at as entertainment. So it's really striking language that she uses. In fact, she refers to the peasants around Lowick Manor as animals, but she contrasts them to the peasants around Freshitt Hall as monsters. They're not even animal status, they're monsters. So I think this question of what counts as a neighbor is a crucial one. It comes up, it becomes linked to the Reform Bill, what it means to share in a political community, democracy, democratic neighborliness, citizenship. So Eliot suggests here that our neighbors' lives are interwoven with our own. Scenes which make a vital change in our neighbor's lot are but the background of our own, yet like a particular aspect of the fields and trees, they become associated for us with the epochs of our own history and make a part of that unity which lies in the selection of our keenest consciousness. So I think she's really pointing out how we think it's just the background, but there's a sort of ecological interweaving of our lots. So it makes this next paragraph a little dubious, a little tricky to read, because it seems to be about Dorothea's particular ardor, like as if Dorothea were strange for caring about her neighbors. But I think that's ironic. I think the larger point the narrator's making here is there's something wrong with the segregation of the gentry from the rest of the life, the thicker life below. The country gentry of old time lived in a rarefied social air, dotted apart on their stations up on the mountain. They looked down with imperfect discrimination on the belts of thicker life below. And Dorothea was not at ease in the perspective and chilliness of that height. I think Eliot's saying she's right to not be at ease, that there's something unhealthy about that chilliness. So maybe again related to the morbidity of Featherstone and Casaubon, this chilly detachment from thicker life, social interaction. Another interesting example, perhaps, of this unhealthy, chilly, morbid detachment of the gentry or aristocracy is Lydgate, who, on the one hand, has this progressive social concern in general. It's a man of science and rationality that's linked with French social theories. But Eliot, I think, ironically mentions that he did not come away with reading French social theory with any smell of scorching. He didn't lose his aristocratic taste, and that causes him problems. That sense of entitlement and kind of naivety about money, social reality gets him into trouble. So I think again that theme of hot and cold, like maybe he would have been better off having been scorched. That would have warmed him to social economic reality. Chapter 37 begins to address the politics of reform, and in terms related to this question of neighborliness. It's an interesting discussion here among the Tory opponents of Mr. Brooke, who's lining with the reform movement, leading this newspaper that's edited and it sounds like written by Will Ladislaw. I think it's interesting how Eliot paraphrases this notable article in the Pioneer. It's time when the crying needs of the country might well counteract a reluctance to public action on the part of men whose minds. So he's characterizing complacency. This is sort of a theme that we've noticed a lot. What is it that makes men's minds complacent? A reluctant to public action. Reluctance on the part of men whose minds had, from long experience, acquired breadth as well as concentration, decision of judgment as well as tolerance, dispassionateness as well as energy. In fact, all those qualities in which the melancholy experience of mankind have been least disposed to share lodgings. So a little bit ambiguous and difficult to parse, but I think the conclusion is telling. It's about sharing lodgings, neighborliness, empathy, concern for your neighbor, breadth as well as concentrated. The point is that you're not helping your neighbors. Are the crying needs now enough to counteract this wishy-washy reluctance? It's like, a child in front of a car in the street. It's just a calling out for action. Can you, not think through as an intellectual question, this moral crisis? Can you just respond to the moral crisis out of concern for your fellow man? Speaking of the antisocial morbidity of like Featherstone and Casaubon, that recalls a description from chapter 29 of Casaubon. It's not where again the narrator's expressing sympathy for Casaubon, but I wonder if it's not that he doesn't deserve sympathy, but I think what she's pointing out here is something that's actually a deep problem, deeply, toxic, that we can be sympathetic because it's causing him to suffer as well as causing other people to suffer. But it's for precisely that reason that it's not to be enabled. We can feel sympathy for his suffering, and actually, for exactly that reason, be intolerant of what's causing his suffering. It's an uneasy lot at best to be what we call highly taught and yet not to enjoy, to be present at this great spectacle of life and never to be liberated from a small, hungry, shivering self, never to be fully possessed by the glory we behold, never to have our consciousness rapturously transformed into the vividness of a thought, the ardor of a passion, the energy of an action, but always to be scholarly and uninspired, ambitious and timid, scrupulous and dim-sighted. So again, he's like caught in this attitude hostile to life. He's trapped in this scholarly but uninspired, ambitious but timid, scrupulous but dim-sighted. It's an impasse that eats life up like a cancer rather than engaging. So later in chapter 37, I think Eliot develops this morbid attitude of Casaubon's. She calls it a burrowing disposition, which suggests that morbidity of the coffin burrowing into the ground. I mean, it does combine the dim-sightedness of the mole that just wants to, like a corpse, go down into retreat into the earth, but combined with the scrupulousness, too shy to act in the world. So he just feeds off the world in this kind of cancerous way. He disliked Will while he helped him, but he had begun to dislike him still more now that Will had declined his help. That's the way with us when we have an uneasy jealousy in our disposition, if our talents are chiefly of the burrowing kind. Our honey-sipping cousin, whom we have grave reasons for objecting to, is likely to have a secret contempt for us, and anyone who admires him passes an oblique criticism on ourselves. So it's a sweeping paranoia. That's what I mean, just about this hostility to life in general. Having the scruples of rectitude in our souls, we're above the meanness of injuring him. See, I think Eliot's suggesting it would be better if he didn't have that scruple. Like, if he just acted, if he, in a more direct way, that at least would be engaging life. But he just burrows. His antipathy to Will did not spring from the common jealousy of a winter-worn husband. It was deeper, bred by his lifelong claims and discontents. But Dorothea, now that she was present, Dorothea, as a young wife who herself had shown an offensive capability of criticism, necessarily gave concentration to the uneasiness which had before been vague. So this lifelong discontent and resentment Dorothea gives it focus, but it's what's focused is fear and resentment and paranoia of life in general. And I think we can see how the metaphors of the narrator, Casaubon's burrowing disposition, dim-sighted scrupulousness, overlap with Will's, even when they come across here as kind of fantastical. He's talking about Dorothea's marriage as the most horrible of virgin sacrifices. He painted to himself what were Dorothea's inward sorrows as if he'd been riding a choric whale. So grandiose, fantastical, but I think consistent with the narrator's characterization And um, he paints himself. We can, I think, we'll see, um, in kind of fairy tale terms, almost like a chivalric romance. Um, that again, you read on, in the context of Eliot's generally realistic prose style. Sounds fantastical, and Will in general seems flighty, so it's easy to dismiss. But I'd like you to consider as you go forward how often maybe the narrator corroborates um, this fairy tale or romantic imagery. Again, Will's speaking in self mythologizing terms. He would never lose sight of her. He would watch over her. If he gave up everything else in life, he would watch over her. And she should know that she had one slave in the world. He's like a hero in his own fantasy. Um, and Eliot underscores this. Will had, to use Sir Thomas Browne's phrase, a passionate prodigality of statement, both to himself and to others. So she's remarking on Will's um, overheated imagination and a literary imagination. He's weaving these myths in his mind, but even as she's mocking it, or even as she's pointing it out, I guess I'm drawing the question. I'm questioning whether she's mocking it or not. This passionate prodigality of statement, does that describe Eliot too? Does that describe Middlemarch too? Scenes between Dorothea and Will are so romantic, in part because they're they're star-crossed lovers, right? I mean, what's remarkable, how many scenes do they have where they're saying goodbye to each other and kind of falling in love with each other as they're saying goodbye? It seems like it's a scenario that keeps getting repeated. They're falling in love despite the impossibility. You know, the metaphors the narrator uses seem right out of fairy tales. It's easy to maybe read them as facetious, just like maybe it's easy to read Will's characterization of Casaubon's virgin sacrifice, you know, with a grain of salt. And and I'm not suggesting otherwise, but I guess I wonder if at the end of the day, Eliot believes in fairy tales, and that's if Eliot thinks that's actually part of the power of literature is kind of fairy tale activation of fantasy, you know, in contrast to all the morbid effects of Casaubon that I've been talking about, the way Will and Dorothea are described looking at each other as if they had been two flowers which had been opened then and there. It seemed fresh water at her thirsty lips to speak without fear to the one person whom she'd found receptive. For in looking backward through sadness, she exaggerated a past solace. So she's being psychologically realistic. She's not denying that Dorothea's exaggerating Will's appeal to her because he's a sight for sore eyes. You know, because of the how bleak her marriage has been. Um, so there's a realism to the slight self-delusion that Dorothy is indulging in here, and she suggests something similar, I think, about Will. Dorothea says, "It seems strange how many things I said to you then." Will says, "I remember them all with the unspeakable content in his soul, a feeling that he was in the presence of a creature worthy to be perfectly loved. I think his own feelings at that moment were perfect, for we mortals have our divine moments when love is satisfied in the completeness of the beloved object." So it's kind of a mystical experience. It's not rational conviction, you're the one for me, but it's and divine. It's a divine moment. It's a mortal access of divinity. So in a way, Eliot's writing a kind of fairy tale of her own, but we can also find passages where Eliot's suggesting that we can write our own fairy tales. We can cultivate this kind of mysticism, or to try to apply it to the world, try to find it in the world actively. Like last week, we were talking about Rosamond's um, shaping activity, that Rosamond's eyes have a shaping activity on the world around her. I think she suggests something similar about, and maybe much more worthy about that in terms of Ladislaw's love for Dorothea. Here, when she writes, to ask her to be less simple and direct would be like breathing on the crystal that you want to see the light through. There was always the other great dread of himself becoming dimmed and forever ray shorn in her eyes. Ray shorn. What's cool about this is it's referring back to a way in which the narrator had described Will's hair as like projecting rays. But here she's applying that thought to Will himself. So it's as if Will has internalized the metaphor of the narrators, of himself, that he wants to maintain his ray emitting image in the narrator's head, or in Dorothea's head, but that's actually the narrator's head. I asked the question this week in the discussion whether we can think of the narrator's imagery here as functioning in terms of Feuerbach's idea that other people serve as my moral conscience. So the narrator articulates the moral conscience, the moral imagination of characters thinking about each other. The narrator is kind of mediating that, and thereby also mediating the reader's imagination. The narrator defines the terms, like of this rays, the being shorn of the rays his hair emits, or the crystal dimmed by breath. It's providing the terms through which we imagine these characters. So these metaphors, like the crystal and the ray, I mean, they're teaching us how to see it. She's showing us how to see the light, but it's a matter of cultivating the light ourselves. He doesn't want to blemish the crystal, and that image, the clear crystal, is shaping his behavior, and thereby he's shaping the reality of the world around him. He's cultivating that perfect beloved object. It's not just there. He's not just receiving this divine experience passively or accidentally. Through active cultivation. Later still in chapter 37, the narrator describes this shaping activity of the imagination. On Dorothea's part, this leads her into one of her lowest moments, when she asks Casaubon in the middle of the night to give half of her inheritance to Will, and he responds so cruelly to never question him again. And this is a real pivotal, I think, moment for his paranoia too. So she was blind, you see, to many things obvious to others, likely to tread in the wrong places, as Celia had warned her. Yet her blindness to whatever did not lie in her own pure purpose carried her safely by the side of precipices where vision would have been perilous with fear. It doesn't seem to be the case here because it has such painful consequences for her marriage. But again, I wonder if this is actually productive in the long run. It's sort of, like the problem with Casaubon's jealousy or whatever is that it's burrowing, that it just retreats from the world. If he acted on it in concrete ways out in the world, maybe that would, cause productive changes. Maybe he would learn from it. He'd communicate better what's going on, with himself. Dorothea is so clueless about Casaubon's jealousy. It's so crazy that she expects Casaubon to be receptive to the idea of giving half of her inheritance to Will. That's how little clue Dorothea has about what's actually going on with Casaubon. But I think this is what Eliot means by imagination is the brood of desire, as a kind of procreative, generative, productive effect. Here she uses the word brood again. When young ardor is set brooding over the conception of a prompt deed, the deed itself seems to start forth with independent life, mastering ideal obstacles. Like imagination gives birth to the deed, and the deed bursts forth with independent life. Even though it might seem destructive, and as in this case, in the short term, I think this is the alternative to the burrowing, retreating resentment of Casaubon. In fact, this idea of imagination as the brood of desire, I think it's meant to be disruptive. I think it's meant to sprout troublesome sprigs. That's how we keep the crystal clear. An ideal object is an object of imagination, of pursuit, ambition. It's not to get complacent with it as something in this world. I think that's the point of this really key passage, where Dorothy is complaining about the picturesque images of the countryside that Mr. Brooke keeps in his house, and while the actual countryside is a scene of so much misery. Dorothy here says, I used to come from the village with all that dirt and coarse ugliness like a pain within me, and the simpering pictures in the drawing room seemed to me like a wicked attempt to find delight in what is false, while we don't mind how hard the truth is for the neighbors outside our walls, neighbors again. I think we have no right to come forward and urge wider changes for good until we have tried to alter the evils which lie under our own hands. So she's standing up for neighborliness, and she's saying the simpering pictures in the drawing room are a false image of neighborliness. They disguise the actual lack of neighborliness. She's drawing attention to troublesome sprigs, to you're celebrating neighborliness in your drawing room, and yet you've sprouted in your actual environment unneighborly effects. She's drawing attention to those unneighborly effects as a way of trying to clear the crystal of the ideal of neighborliness. And I think Eliot really underscores the visionary power of Dorothea's idealism here. Will even fails to appreciate it for sexist reasons. For the moment, Will's admiration was accompanied with a chilling sense of remoteness. A man is seldom ashamed of feeling that he cannot love a woman so well when he sees a certain greatness in her. This is a certain greatness. This is like Teresa shining through that in a way that the men can't even, they're kind of troubled by it. Like Dorothea's crystal clarity it's so singular, it's hard even for Will, the idealist, to appreciate. I think this focus on the crystal clear ideal even in the midst of the, dirt and evil under our own hands, is what Dorothy describes in kind of cryptic terms as her religion, the religion that she keeps finding out. Um, she doesn't want it called in terms of any name. I've always been finding out my religion since I was a girl. By desiring what is perfectly good, even when we don't quite know what it is and cannot do what we would, we are part of the divine power against evil, widening the skirts of light and making the struggle with darkness narrower. I think that's another way of talking about that shaping activity of the ideal. And Will takes it as a kind of complacency. He says, I'm a rebel. I don't feel bound as you do to submit to what I don't like. And then Dorothea responds again kind of cryptically. It might not be clear what she's saying, but if you like what is good, that comes to the same thing. And Will says that's subtle, but I think her point is she's keeping her focus on what's good. It's not that she's complacent. It's that she's focused on desiring what's perfectly good. She's not focusing on what's disappointing, what she resents about the world. She's focused on what the world could be, and that isn't to blind her to the evil or the dirt under our own hands. On the contrary, it makes her point that out. Indeed, I think that's what she means by I'm always finding out my religion. It's through the actual experience of the world, through actual life, that she finds her aspirations, what she desires is perfectly good. This and gives birth to the images that even if she can't do what we would do, this imagination, this brood of images has a shaping effect on the world around her. And again, I think Eliot beautifully underscores the kind of fairy tale idealism of this scene, the sort of divine entrancement of the two lovers, describing them as looking at each other like two fond children who are talking confidentially of birds. It's this miraculous transmission of miracles, bearing witness, childlike witness to the wonder of the world. Chapter 39 ends with one of the great set pieces of Middlemarch. This encounter between Mr. Brooke and the drunk farmer Dagley. And this scene hinges on the disconnect that Dorothea was just complaining about, the disconnect between the simpering pictures of the picturesque countryside in the drawing room of Tipton Manor, and the actuality of the peasants working outside. And what's crucial to think about here is that Eliot's text itself is offering us a version of the simpering picturesque countryside. We read here, just as Middlemarch has at other points, like I really emphasized in Book 1, the midland-bred soul, the way in which personhood, physiognomy seem to be embedded in the land. The land that Eliot was finding in the picturesque beauty of the landscape, an image of what it means to be a person. And so she's really calling that in question here. Or what I would say is that she's complicating it. She's showing the dirt under our own hands and making us weave a more complex picture of what the beauty of the environment actually consists in. And that's exactly what she describes here. Picturesque beauty but she's exposing the hardship underneath. It's true that an observer under the softening influence of the fine arts, which makes other people's hardships picturesque, I mean, that describes us, readers of this novel. By making us reflect critically on the pleasure that we take from novel reading, this novel in particular that celebrates the Midland bred soul. um, Eliot is really trying to bring to the forefront the politics of reform, the complexity of the question of what it means to be a good neighbor, to treat other people um, with concern. So these troublesome associations were just now strongly present to Mr. Brooke and spoiled the scene for him. And the scene comes most vividly to life here in the voice of Dagley himself. I think this passage of vernacular focuses this question. Dagley here is expressing confusedly, drunkenly, the reform movement. He is animated by the spirit of reform, by the reform movement. Even if he doesn't understand it, that's really not the point. The point is it's animating his speech, and it's changing his behavior and changing Brooke's behavior. He's so surprised by, he doesn't know how to really comprehend what happens here. So Eliot's language, giving a new dimension to the picturesque countryside, but also representing the politics of reform, the spirit of reform. She's weaving the two together: representation of the land, representation of politics, representation of personhood.
It seemed wiser to be quite passive than to attempt a ridiculous flight pursued by a bawling man.
I'm no more drunk nor you are, no so much, said Dagley. I can carry my liquor, and I know what I mean. And I mean, as the king will put a stop to it for them to say it as knows it as there's to be reform. And them landlords have never done the right thing, but their tenants will be treated in that way, as they'll have to scuttle off. And then there's them in Middlemarch knows what the reform is, and as knows will lay the scuttle, says they. I know who your landlord is, and says I hope you're the better for knowing him. I aren't, says they. He's a close-fisted, and I, says I. He's a man for the reform, says they. And that's what they says, and I made out what the reform were, and were to send you and your likes a scuttling, and with pretty strong smelling things too, and you may do as you like now, for I'm none afeard of you, and you better let my boy alone and look to yourself afore their informers got your back. That's what I'm got to say, concluded Mr. Dagley, striking his fork into the ground with a firmness which proved inconvenient as he tried to draw it up again.
And there's a pointed contrast with Caleb Garth. It says, when Brooke had quarreled with Caleb Garth 12 years before, he had thought that the tenants would be pleased at the landlord's taking everything into his own hands. That's what's different now. The reform movement has made a difference. Mr. Brooke cannot be so complacent this time. Now he's amazed by the novelty of his situation. But what's different is the movement of reform has a shaping activity on the behavior of tenants like Dagley that amaze Brooke and change his behavior. So, which ultimately results in Caleb Garth getting hired back.